panel 3 to the table, and I'll introduce the 3 witnesses. Mr. Adel Gendi, President of the Coptic Solidarity International; Cynthia Farhat, Egyptian political activist, writer, and researcher; and Raymond Ibrahim, Middle East specialist and Associate Fellow, Middle East Forum. We thank you for coming. Your testimony will be, written testimony will be entered into the record. And at this point, Chair would like to recognize Mr. Bilirakis, if you have any open statements. None. And we're being joined also by Jeff Duncan. Do you have any opening statement? Chair recognizes the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you for taking this important issue up. I was on Monday, we came back up, had a meeting with Cynthia, and educating myself on the issue of the Coptic Christians in Egypt. And so I look forward to learning more about this, but also discussing possibly through a question series of some of the things we talked about relating to visa applications of persecuted Christians wanting to come to the U.S. There's a lot of depth here that we can really go into. And so as this being the first hearing that I've ever sat in on, I look forward to seeing the flow of information and really delving into the topic. So I appreciate your leadership. May you yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and now recognizes Mr. Gendi. You're recognized, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for holding this important hearing about the subject of the Copts.
Is your mic on? Yeah, if you can press, have the light come on.
Is that on?
Yeah, that's good.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for your leadership and that of Chairman Wolf and Franks and other distinguished congressmen who have been giving us unwavered support over the years. I'm honored to be here today, and I would like to request that my entire written statement be made part of the record. It's too long to be read. Of course, it's 9 pages, so I'm going to pick on a few important things which I think are indicative of what's going on in Egypt. I would start by describing the situation in Egypt, the depiction in keeping with the depiction of summer, of spring of this and winter of that. I think Egypt is entering into a harsh summer with little to be seen in its arid deserts beyond thirst, agony, and mirage. The first mirage is what is being hailed as a historic transition to democracy. It's a charade of a democracy, what's going on in Egypt today, right from the beginning, by design. In this land here, you start with a Bill of Rights, a constitution to set the rules of the game, and then you build the institutions. In Egypt, by design, the military and the Islamist Brotherhood have reversed the sequence and were intent against the desires and the requests of the revolutionaries and many secularist politicians right from the beginning, right from February, to start with a decent constitution, and they reversed the sequence to start with elections. That way, the elections, every kid in Egypt knew that it's going to be won by the Islamists. That way, they will make the constitution that's to their liking. So what's going on today, it's a charade of a process right from the beginning. Apart from the irregularities in the process itself of the elections of the past, the first phase one. And in fact, even all along the process, you know, in Egypt, even by law, you do not make a party which is based on religious or race foundation. 15 out of the 31 newly authorized parties in Egypt over the past 10 months have been all religious-based and openly asking for the application of Sharia. So that's the first charade. The first mirage. The second mirage is going into a civilian government. Egypt is entering a phase of an alliance of rule by the military and civilians. The facade will be civilian to the liking of the United States and the international community, but the force and the power behind the scenes will be held by the military. There is a marriage of convenience or maybe by conviction, I don't know, it doesn't matter at that stage, between the two groups, and this is going to be the face of the ruling in Egypt for the next years. So these expectations, we see op-eds here and there asking for passage from military to civilian. It's going to happen. There's no problem at all. The military are not interested in governing Egypt on a day-to-day basis. That's, in fact, a non-starter. They're not interested at all. They're interested in the authority and the power which they've held for the past 6 decades. All the presidents so far came from between them. Many prime ministers, ministers, heads of organizations. The economy, the army controls an economy which amounts to about 30–40% of the economy of Egypt. It's a black economy, it's a black box without any scrutiny or control of anybody. The budget, it's out of scrutiny of the People's Assembly, and they have said clearly they're going to maintain that in the future. So the couple or the alliance of military and Islamists are going to take over Egypt. The road may be rocky over the time. Maybe the balance of power is not clear today. They both have interest in working together in governing Egypt for the next few years. But you don't know. We don't know. In fact, one prediction is that the Islamists who control the street may feel strong enough at one point to subdue the army, which is the same situation that happened in Iran, in fact. You subdue the army by doing some kind of cleansing, ideological or physical cleansing, to have an army under the arms of the Islamists. So we are entering a very rocky period. It's not a rocky transition towards democracy like some people would like to imagine or think. It's a rocky downhill process, which is not at all encouraging. I think we need to be prepared for what's going on and do not applaud all the appearances of democracy in Egypt, which takes me, I mean, there are so many details about why is this alliance between the two and what the army the SCAF has been doing over the past few months, but for the sake of time, I'll skip that. I may come back to it if you have any questions. The second mirage is, in fact, the idea that the Islamist parties are just like any other religious parties. Why not the Christian parties? And I quote here Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when she spoke at the National Democratic Institute's 2011 Democracy Awards dinner, just November 7th. It's a long quote. I'm going to just say, so there are plenty of political parties with religious affiliations, Hindu, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, that respect the rules of democracy. The suggestion, I mean, I would very respectfully but strongly disagree with that statement. If you take the Christian parties in the world, take the Germany's Christian Democratic Party, and try to think for a second that it has anything to do with a party like the Brotherhood, it's outrageous, in fact. The history, the movement of Christian parties started early 19th century. If you look at the history, the evolution, what they stand for, their current agenda, and you compare that with any Islamist party, it's like pretending that sulfuric acid and water are equal because they are both of them fluids. It's a day and night. The Islamist parties are followers of totalitarian ideology. In fact, it's even worse than the other totalitarian ideologies the world knew during the 20th century, because they pretend to speak in the name of God. So the world needs to be aware that what's happening there, it's not a democracy. The pretension that these parties will become democratic. I mean, we hear some amazing things like, mainstream Islamist or moderate Islamist is like talking about, a mainstream Nazi party or a moderate fascist party. These are equivalent. The contradiction of terms there are amazing. Then the Copts, where do the Copts feel there? The whole situation is going into, if it is a theocratic or a military theocratic state, is a semi-theocratic state, everybody, what is being called sometimes Tahrir II, which is the demonstrations that happened in Tahrir over the week from the 19th to the 24th, 25th of November, was preceded by an enormous demonstration by Islamists on Friday the 18th. For what? For one word. People have been working on a kind of a constitutional principles document for the past 6 or 7 months. Has many things, sometimes mostly contradictory, in fact. But anyway, at one point, at one phrase, a sentence to describe the future state was saying that it's a civilian state. Civilian, it's to avoid talking about secular, not only that, but it means non-theocratic and non-military. With these two meanings in mind, in fact, in the same document, there is also the stipulation which has been in the past, the old defunct constitution about Islam being the religion of state and principles of Sharia being the main source of legislation. So that's already in there. Yet the Islamists started to worry about the word or the expression civilian might be construed, as the lawyers would like to say, into a possibility of becoming a secular state, and they were, violently, demonstrating in the streets in Tahrir, hundreds of thousands of them. Of course, by the evening of that date, the commission, which is a governmental commission, deleted that single word or description from the committee and caved in completely. And of course, the next few days, the docile government turned into a lion against the revolutionaries and so on, which Dina has described before. Where do the Copts fall into that? The Copts are, apart from the systematic persecution, in fact, it's systemic also, and it's going to be more so when they are treated as dhimmis in an Islamist state. And the taste of that has been given to them again and again over the past 6 months, not only by the street, by the parties, by the Islamists, by the military council itself, when the way it treated them. And in fact, what happened, the big massacre of Maspero on October the 9th, was made to give them a harsh lesson. In fact, when the military took over from Mubarak on February the 10th or 11th, they committed not to shoot at citizens, never, ever. They have largely kept that until the 9th of October, the first time the army shoots and crushes people, and these were the Christians, the Coptic Christians. That happened again in the November 25 story there. I'll jump straight to the recommendations, and I have 6 of them. One is the Constitution. There must be an insistence by the international community about the inclusion of the adherence and full adherence and acceptance of human rights norms upheld in the foundational part of the new constitution. The world needs, at this stage, there must be a third alternative, because, you ask pragmatic governments, we have the army on the one hand, the Islamists, what do we do? Which one? We should not be stuck with one or the other. The world must be able to choose to encourage, for the sake of Egypt, for the sake of the world, for the sake of the security of the area, to encourage the liberal secularist forces in Egypt, which do include the Copts. Copts are part of that movement. There hasn't been enough, in fact, with so much open doors and channels and discussion talks between Western countries, especially the US administration and the Islamists, has been very, very modest effort to engage with the liberal secularist movements there. Third recommendation is implementation of justice. There's been very seldom implementation of justice in Egypt. We encourage the authorities there to take it more seriously. The massacre of Maspero, for example, basically not the only, I mean, the majority of those arrested are Copts. The perpetrators are the army, the other thugs in the street, which are mobilized by the secret police and so on, but yet the only people in jail are 28 Copts plus a few Muslim activists who have been bravely supporting the cause of the Copts. We would like to request and encourage the US government to create a kind of blacklist to ban certain officials who might be identified by victims from entering the United States. This is not difficult. There are usually enough evidence against these people. They can be given the right to defend themselves if that's required, to be fair. But at least that is the least of things to be done, so that you don't kill somebody and the next day you get a visa to the States and Europe. The fourth point is about foreign aid. I'm delighted to hear again and again the idea of the linkage of aid to performance of human rights. And in fact, it's not only the United States. This applies to the rest of the world. I was amazed to discover a couple of weeks ago that the G8, in its meeting in France in May, has started working on a package of aid for the Arab Spring countries, and they gave an ex-prime minister of France the duty of investigating the subject, and he presented his report in the G20 at the G20 meeting in France too, just 3 weeks ago, during which he's talking about allocating about $20 billion or $30 billion to Egypt over the next 3 years. And not only that, I mean, he makes an astounding statement. Not only that people don't want or hesitate to link aid to any constraints, he makes the commitment to the opposite. He says, obviously, there shouldn't be, through that partnership, any attempt of political tutelage over the aid-receiving countries, which would be doomed to fail. I found that flabbergasting. I mean, the simple question is...
Could you conclude, sir?
Okay. The next point is the special envoy. The HR 440 has been adopted, and we strongly recommend the 1245 to be adopted too. And the last one is the U.S. and international community must stop appeasing Islamists and instead hold them accountable when they abuse human rights. Once again, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I repeat, it's in the interest in Egypt and the world that Egypt be guided properly in the right direction in the next few years. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and would ask the witnesses to confine their remarks to 5 minutes. Recognizes Ms. Farhat for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be able to testify today in front of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission about the status and plight of Copts in Egypt. I'm a Coptic classic liberal political activist. I'm also a writer and researcher in Egypt. I just came to the U.S. Last month. I've been involved in the political process for over a decade, and I've addressed the protesters in Tahrir Square, and also I've been involved in Maspero protests. To be able to discuss the plight of Copts and why they are persecuted in Egypt, I would have to ask the question: who are the current rulers of Egypt? Who are the Supreme Council of Armed Forces? What is their ideology? And are they secular autocrats, like they like to give the impression to Western governments, or is it something else? What I claim here, and these are all historic facts, that the current military oligarchy originates from the Muslim Brotherhood organization. In 1952, the free officers perpetrated a coup d'etat against the Egyptian monarch. The free officers were the branch of the military wing of the Muslim Brotherhood organization. They only split after the death and the assassination of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, in 1949. Before that, they were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, including the first president of Egypt, the actual first president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and in 1444 he joined and swore allegiance to Hassan al-Banna on a gun and Quran. This is the founding father. This is according to Khalid Muhyiddin, a fellow free officer and also previously a member of parliament in Egypt. This is according to his own biography. These are the founding fathers. Almost 90 people that perpetrated the 1952 coup d'etat were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the reality of the basis of the current ideological foundation of the Egyptian army and the regime and the oligarchy that has had control for over 6 decades, 60 years of this. This is what we are having, and it was inevitable that Sharia law becomes part of the constitution. In 1971, President Sadat introduced Sharia law to the constitution, and now I think it qualifies to say that Egypt is a constitutional theocracy and it's not a modern state. The consequences were that Copts are no longer, according to Sharia law, identified or defined as citizen. I have an Egyptian passport, but I'm not a citizen. The concept of citizenship is a Western concept that does not apply to us in Egypt. I'm a woman and I'm Copt. I'm a 4th-class citizen in Egypt. The 1st-class citizen in Egypt is the Sunni male, Muslim male. The 2nd class is the Sunni female. The 3rd class is the Coptic male, and the 4th class is the Coptic female. And that's why none of the people that committed crimes, none of the criminals that committed crimes against Copts were prosecuted in any way because it is against Sharia law, and that's a fact, it's not an opinion, to persecute someone for a Muslim for killing, raping, torturing, or vandalizing the property of a non-Muslim or a dhimmi. So this is our legal status, and this has been happening under the Mubarak's so-called moderate regime, an ally of the West, and it's now happening now. It was only inevitable that they take their radicalism a step further and start killing Copts in the street in front of TV cameras with live ammunition and running them over with armored military vehicles they probably got from the United States of America. One of my friends was in the protest. I was supposed to go there on the 9th with him and with other people. What happened was my friend was there, Michael Mossad, with his fiancée Vivian, and they were walking. And he felt when the army started attacking the Maspero, and they saw them screaming Allahu Akbar like they are going on an Islamic fath and an invasion, they got scared and they decided to leave. But he called his family and he told them, I'm going to die tonight, and I want to say goodbye because I'm going to get killed tonight. That's what happened to my friend. He got on the pavement and then they turned around to leave. But what happened was the armored vehicle got on the pavement to intentionally run him over. And they did run him over and almost severed his legs from his body and crushed his skull. And as Michael was lying there, breathless and dying, his fiancée kept screaming for help, asking someone to come and help him. Or what happened was the military started beating him up. They kept beating up his motionless body and beating her up and spitting on her and calling her an infidel and so much worse. At the same time, while this was happening, I was watching Egyptian television where a military official would say, would talk about the Copts, and he would say the Christian sons of dogs. We are, according to the state, the Christian sons of dogs. That's how the state defines us. And this is the current ally of the United States of America. So that's the situation, and that's what happened in Maspero. Busaina Kamel, a moderate Muslim and secular Muslim TV personality and journalist in Egypt, said that she was in Maspero, and I also know her. She was there, and as she got terrified of the attacks by the military, she went to hide inside the building of Al Hurra TV channel. What happened was, she said, the military started attacking the building while screaming Allahu Akbar, dragging Christians inside the building and beating them and torturing them. And then when she said the screams stopped and we felt we were safe to get out of the building, she said we were walking in blood of Copts, and to get out of the building alive or safe, you had to say, I'm a Muslim who believes in one Allah. That was a jihadist attack. This looks like a jihadist attack. It doesn't look like military trying to protect or stabilize a situation. That was religiously inspired. After that, also Nawara Nigm, she is a Muslim political activist and also a TV personality. She stated that she saw the military checking the hands of Copts for crosses before attacking and torturing them in the street. They kept around checking the hands of protesters because most Copts put crosses on their hands. And there are people in this room, there are Copts in this room with crosses in their hands who wouldn't have passed this test of the military. There's something that was also happening. This was the situation at Maspero, and it was even so much worse. If I had more time, I could even write a book from the amount of testimonies and my personal friends and my losses, my personal loss that day. What I would like to add that right now, currently, the Egyptian regime, military regime, is transforming into a Pakistani model. We are now approaching another Pakistan in Egypt. It is going to be inevitable unless there are serious measures taken to dismantle the current status quo. Saudi Arabia and Qatar are now funding Salafi jihadists in the Muslim Brotherhood. And the US is now currently funding the military that has evidently funded the Muslim Brotherhood in the past elections. As former Ambassador Mark Ginsburg states in his article last month, that he confirms evidence that the military is funding Salafi jihadists, the Al-Qaeda-style jihadists, and the Muslim Brotherhood, obviously from money that might have come from the USA. And also, they have brokered deal with Salafi jihadists. Now, to force the West, what the equation is, they want to force their Western so-called allies to choose either between the military dictatorship or between the Islamists. That's the equation, although that's not the reality of things. Tahrir Square was filled with moderates and was filled with secular Muslims. There are 6 million Sufis that are formally cooperating with Copts that could be a better alternative instead of this vicious equation. Right now, the equation is Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi jihadists, Egyptian military, and the US on one side, and now the Copts and seculars, and moderate forces, and moderate Muslims are on the other. And I think the US have always been our ally, and this is not part of the equation that they should be. When President Bush's administration suggested that they might condition aid, our lives became immediately better in Egypt. It was like someone clicked on a button and the world looked totally and entirely and completely different. What happened was Mubarak had to leverage, because that's how America gets leverage, and by giving us more freedom. And what we did was we started co-founding secular political parties that called for, that were against Islamic imperialism and against theocracy and pro-free market and human rights. In this atmosphere, we were able to work because that's how countries reform to better ideas and modern ideas. When secular Muslims and moderate Muslims and Copts are getting death threats, how are we going to how are we going to spread our ideas? Not everyone can tolerate getting messages like the messages and the death threats I used to get. That's not an atmosphere that is open to spread ideas of reform and modernity. So that's the current situation now.
All right.
What we would like to ask, and my conclusion of this is America should look at the plight of Copts as a national security issue for America. It's not only a humanitarian crisis, but these are the true allies of the United States and true believers of the ideas and the beautiful ideas that this country stands for. These are the true allies. In conclusion, 3 things must happen in order for the Coptic Christians and moderate Muslims to stand a chance of seeing their present human rights situation in Egypt improve significantly. First, the United States should cease all American aid to Egypt until there is verifiable evidence that the Egyptian government is allowing non-Muslim religious minorities in Egypt to exercise the freedom of speech and religion without fear of intimidation. Second, President Obama's administration should explain and possibly reevaluate its vetting process of foreign national employees or advisors of American embassies, particularly in Egypt, where Egyptian nationals loyal to the regime have used their embassy positions to make it hard for Copts to apply for religious asylum requests to the United States from the American embassy in Cairo, out of fear of being targeted by Egyptian state security. Third and finally, the United States must avoid legitimizing joint effort by the Muslim Brotherhood and Egypt's ruling military regime to use blasphemy law against non-Muslim minorities in Egypt, and therefore should decline to meet with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, to discuss any agenda to apply blasphemy laws globally under the pretext of confronting Islamophobia.
Chair, thanks to the gentlelady. Now recognize Mr. Ibrahim for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm taking somewhat of a different approach. I think one of the best things to begin to understand the situation for the Copts and how it's being exacerbated is to establish context for starters. And the fact is, what we are having a hearing about tonight, or today, I'm sorry, is about a phenomenon that has been going on for about 1,400 years. This is not something new. And so the key to understand to where we are today is to establish the continuity from former centuries past. And the amazing thing is, when you look at history, and this is my field, history and doctrine, when you look at these two, especially history, you will find that what happened to the Coptic people when Islam invaded Egypt in the 7th century, and as recorded by reliable Muslim historians, medieval Muslim historians who had no great love for the Copts, when you look at these texts, you will find that they are identical to what is happening today. And the parallels are just outstanding how identical they are, and I'll just give you some examples. Of course, there's the attacks on Copts in general. That has been going on. Attacks on churches. I was reading the other day from a medieval source, of a primary source from a Muslim who talked about in one emir's reign in that time, they destroyed 3,000 churches. Abduction of girls, Christian girls, rape, and forced conversions, plunder as expectations from second-class citizen Copts, taking what's called the jizya, collective punishment. All of these have past precedents for 1,400 years and are well documented in Islam's own historical texts. Now, when you look at that and you bring it to today, and we fast forward to the 21st century and what we're seeing today, to me, this is the key. Now you understand that this is not an aberration, what we're seeing. This is not something strange, but rather part and parcel of Islamic history, and especially in Egypt. And I'm mentioning to you Islamic primary sources, and I think that's important because these are not sources that were written by, polemicists or Christians or non-Muslims, but by Islam's own most authoritative and revered historians and theologians. And they make it unequivocally clear that Islam, from its entrance into Egypt, decimated the Coptic people and their churches and all but their civilization. There were a few, of course, times when it was better, and then it would get worse. And one for example, person is he's known as Al-Makrizi, and he's one of the most popular and authoritative historians of Egypt, medieval Egypt. And he, again, while you read it and you see that he's a very faithful Muslim and he has no great sympathy for the Copts, he is so objective and he declares all of these points that we are talking about today. So the reason I bring this to you, again, is to show that the continuity is there. This is nothing new. This is nothing strange. Now we come up to, I mentioned a little bit of history. I'd like to quickly discuss some doctrinal issues. And the word dhimmi, which was not known before but has become somewhat famous nowadays, and including a coinage of it, which is dhimmitude. And I think that's all good because these words need to come out in the open. I think it's also a little bad because they've been somewhat taken out of context and popularized inaccurately. But the word itself, in fact, is integral to Islamic law, the word dhimmi. And from the beginning of Islam's entry into Egypt and the other non-Muslim territories, a dhimmi is a person, a non-Muslim who, of course, does not accept Islam, wants to maintain the religious identity, in this case, the Christian Copts. But to do so, they have to accept several debilitating and humiliating circumstances. And this goes to the Quran. The Quran itself, Quran 9, Surah 9, verse 29 says to Muslims, fight the people of the book, and these of course include Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, which basically means tribute to their overlords, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves utterly subdued. Now this is the Quran, and to Muslims this is the infallible word of God that transcends all time and has applied back then in the era that I'm discussing, and to many Muslims today, applies today and needs to be upheld vis-a-vis people like the Copts and non-Muslims. And so what it ultimately means, this concept of dhimmi, is someone who does not want to become a Muslim, who willingly has to accept second-class citizen status, and whose rights ultimately depend on the goodwill of the Muslim overlords. And another seminal treatise that was written and goes back, and it's called the Pact of Omar, named after either the first caliph or probably another caliph by the same name. But this pact, again, when you read it, it was what Christians had to sign in order to not be molested and destroyed. And among the things that it says is, number one, we Christians cannot build or repair our churches. We cannot practice our religion openly. We must show respect to Muslims. We must not offend Muslims. It even says we shall rise from our seats when they wish to sit down. All of this was enforced then. All of it is coming back now in strong force. Now, all of it has been now. For example, the issue of churches in Egypt, as you see, they're always being attacked. They're always being destroyed. As far as the government is concerned, it's like pulling teeth just to try to get a permit to repair a church. And again, this goes to these pacts and these doctrines, which are so little known in the West, and which seem to be just some. When you talk to people about it, they hear these words and they think these are just some sort of throwback from ancient history, and they're really not that relevant today. But they're immensely relevant to those and to the practitioners of the faith who think of these as divine institutions of their religion. And then there's another aspect to all of this. I've discussed the historic and the doctrinal aspects of keeping Copts and others, non-Muslims, suppressed. But there's a word that's not well known at all, and it was coined a few decades ago, and it's called Islamicate. And what Islamicate means is that just because Islam teaches, let's say, X, Y, and Z, but as a culture, a Muslim need not necessarily be a religious or a pious Muslim to start doing these things, because they become ingrained and permeate the culture. So seeing a Copt as, for example, a second-class citizen, whether you're a secular Muslim or not, these sorts of things feed into the culture and the worldview of the general populace of Egypt. And so the radical Muslim, of course, will be more hostile and more fierce, but even the general Muslim or the people in the military who do not identify themselves as radicals. Because of the 1400 years of these institutionalized forms of discrimination, these ideas have become just part of the worldview of so many people in Egypt, unfortunately. And but usually it became into sort of a discrimination. But now, as you see these Islamist parties, such as the Salafists, who are getting, lots of, I think, 20% of the vote. And what are they doing? They're going beyond little things like discrimination, and now they want to reinstitutionalize things like the jizya, which again goes back. Goes back to that Quranic verse I read, which says, "Fight them until they pay tribute." Jizya means paying tribute, which is a way of acknowledging that you are a second-class citizen and you're buying your life because you're paying for it. You're being blackmailed, and so now these people who are being voted into the new government of Egypt, the Salafists, are calling openly for the return of jizya. And of course, it's not just a matter of money, but with the return of jizya comes all of these other aspects of quote-unquote dhimmitude to be expected of Copts, which includes no more churches at all whatsoever, no more, you have to hide your religious identity, no crosses in public, and so forth, and all of these other types of debilitations. Now, and then you have the Brotherhood. Now, the Brotherhood, of course, the problem is I think there's so many people who see the Brotherhood and the Salafists as sort of, one's moderate and one's radical. That's, of course, a joke. The Muslim Brotherhood, a better way to see it, or to give you an American analogy, is you can think of them as the Muslim Brotherhood are the Democrats and the Salafists are the Republicans. In other words, they're two faces of the same coin. Because in America, Democrats and Republicans, of course, have different viewpoints, but they are all based on the same source, and they are all based on the same paradigm. And it's the same for these Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood. Whatever their little differences are, they all go back and trace their sources to Sharia law, which is which is clear-cut what it says. But also, the Muslim Brotherhood are a little smarter than the Salafists because they know the game and they know they're not going to sit up now and start talking about institutionalizing jizya or dhimmi status for Copts. They're not going to say that now, whereas the Salafists will say it now. But at any rate, now you have these two groups who are at about 60% of who won 60% of the votes, and their opinions of the Copts go straight back to what I was discussing from 1400 years ago, which is this worldview that they are there to be plundered, kept suppressed, and their churches destroyed, and this is why we're seeing it all now. Now, I started earlier by saying that somewhat we're here having a hearing about a phenomenon that's been going 1400 years. So why are we having a hearing? Why is this new? It's new because it's sort of, this goes to somewhat of intellectual history, but if you look at what happened last 200 years of the colonial era, when the Western powers invaded and colonized the Muslim world, what happened then is, and this is a fact, is so many of the Muslims turned their back on Islam in a way. In other words, they were just secular, and Islam was just something that was not taken seriously. And this is well known, and a perfect example, of course, is Ataturk, who abolished the caliphate in 1928, I believe, and he, of course, this was the nation which was the head of the Muslim world. So right at the early 20th century, what you had is Muslims were experimenting with westernizing and secularizing and modernization and nationalism. This is what happened. Now, during that era, yes, Coptic persecution was markedly subdued, and this is also a fact. The discrimination, the subtle things, they were still there, but the sort of wholesale attacks that we're seeing today were really not that present. Now, what this has done, though, because this new approach went on for a few generations, is it's created a Western worldview that does not see the earlier precedents or the past history. So now, in history classes, and when we discuss the history of the Middle East and Egypt, we just start talking about the Muslim world, or from about the 1900s and the 20th century, where no, there wasn't a lot of persecution, and if anything, the paradigm is that the West was the evil oppressive force and the Muslim world was not. So this, I think, has created an intellectual hurdle to understand what's really going on. And of course, it's exacerbated tremendously by the Western mainstream media, which, as some of my colleagues has pointed out, never really reports the truth or really equivocates. They use the term sectarian strife when you have a few thousand Muslims who go burn down a church, and they call that sectarian strife, which in my mind suggests, two equally powerful forces like Sunnis and Shias killing each other. And that's not the case, but the media tries so hard to come off neutral. And I even remember during the Maspero massacre, where the tanks were intentionally running down and mowing over Copts and killing them and opening fire. Fox News, which is considered the conservative, balanced one, was telling us about how soldiers were crying as they watched Copts attack their fellow soldiers. Okay. And then the holders and the articulators of knowledge in the West have completely undermined reality. And the same goes with academia. Academia, especially area studies, seems to exist solely now just to put the best spin on things and to make, if you're area studies in a Muslim world, none of these things that we're talking about, these historical aspects, these primary sources, Quranic and historical that I quoted, you'll never hear these. And I know on first-hand experience. I was at Georgetown, for instance, for a while, and every class was based upon how either the Islamic world has been abused or how, we have to understand them, we have to appease them, and this sort of thing. So it is unfortunate that we have all these intellectual hurdles that are making something that is 1,400 years old and so obvious to anyone who has studied this and looked at this. It's unintelligible to us today, and we have to have a hearing to even start talking about it. And it is because of all of these forces, whether they're intellectual history and sort of anachronisms, or whether it's the mainstream media and political correctness run amok, or academia. But this is the situation we're at, and there's nothing new. But I think the good news, apparently, is that we're still in the early stage. There's still many Egyptians in Egypt, including Muslims, who are not of that variety, who are not the Salafists or the Muslim Brotherhood. And so we are not exactly in the medieval era where it's a wholesale massacre. And so I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and what needs to be done, of course, is to support, and as my colleagues all said, aid must be conditional upon these sorts of things. We must identify and support the liberal voices, because they are our friends. The idea of saying, democracy, using that word, and everything has to stop and end before that word, is ridiculous. Because what's happening in Egypt is democracy means the people are going to bring the sort of government they want, and ostensibly that sounds good and fair. But when they bring a fascistic government, Hitler, for instance, the people brought him to power. The people had support for him. So that doesn't mean we should. What I submit then is we should not always stand beholden before the word democracy as if it's this sort of sacrosanct thing. We have to understand it's a mode of governance, but what really matters is what the people themselves do create with this mode once they're empowered. And if the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists and these fellows all get into power, it's going to be a travesty to Copts. It's going to be a travesty to non-Muslims like the Baha'is. It's going to be a travesty to secular Muslims, and it will be also a problem for the international community, including the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Just a couple of questions. First, Cynthia, you used a term I didn't quite understand. What they called Coptics. Did you say sons of Christian dogs? Is that what you said?
Yes.
That's the term?
Dogs.
What?
Christian sons of dogs.
Christian sons of dogs.
Yes.
I see. That's the term who used?
The military said this on television on 9th of October. I watched this, and it's all over YouTube. That's how they referred to Copts. They call them sons of dogs, the Christian sons of dogs.
Okay. Mr. Gendi, why do the Salafists appear to have emerged so suddenly and so strongly on the scene to the point of this showing in the recent election? What was their status under the Mubarak regime? Were they as strong then as they are now?
Salafists, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Salafists actually, it's literally means the ancestrals, the followers of the ancestral. And it's an offshoot of the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia. They have been created and encouraged by a flood of money from Saudi Arabia all along the Mubarak regime. And in fact, they've been encouraged but they were not politicized at the time. They were not like the Brotherhood. Brotherhood fighting, they tried to enter the parliament, for instance, under Mubarak and so on, but the Salafists were sort of invading the mosques. Virtually 30–40% of the mosques in Egypt, with the encouragement of the government, were under the Salafists to please the Saudi masters, and also to create, in the view of Mubarak's aides, create a competitor to the Brotherhood. And once Mubarak is gone, they came out, and their force, the real force on the ground, they have been creeping underground for the past 20–30 years.
I think you mentioned a fragmentation between liberals and secular organizations in the current context. What was their status during Mubarak's rule?
It's amazing that during the Mubarak rule, everybody in the West thought that Mubarak and Islamist or Brotherhood are enemies. Not at all. They were two sides of the same coin, and both agreed on one thing, which is to fight, eliminate or alienate all the secular, because the secularist groups and liberal groups, including the Copts, are the enemies of both, of Mubarak and the Islamists. So they have been under strong pressure during the Mubarak years. You could see on the TV, for instance, Islamists showing up and speaking, as long as they don't attack Mubarak and his regime strongly. You could see, of course, the Mubarak guys, but the liberals were subdued all along. Now, after the revolution actually has been started by the secularists. And one of the two most famous slogans of the revolution right from the first day, the first one was Pacific, Pacific, to stop the military attack of the security forces. And the second one was civilian, civilian. I came back to what they said on November the 18th. They didn't want that because in their mind, they do not want Egypt to be liberated from a Mubarak dictatorship and enter into an Islamist dictatorship. So right from day one, civilian, civilian, which means they want a civilian state. They are fragmented because they're weak. They have never had time to create roots, create parties. It's only 6 months, since the parties, and even the law has been announced in July or something, so they had no real time to prepare the ground. And on top of that, not on top of that, the main issue is that the Islamists have had the time over the past 3 decades to invade the country, because the government had, or the Mubarak regime had the top rules, but the mosques were in the hands of either the Islamists or the Brotherhood, the Salafist or the Brotherhood. The weaker side of that equation have always been the liberal secularists.
Cynthia, your testimony on your friend who was killed, I think you said run over by a tank, was quite moving. Did you say that they were beating him and his friend or girlfriend after they ran over him?
Yes, after they ran him over and he was lying on the ground motionless and barely breathing, they kept kicking his body and kicking his head after his skull was fractured, and they beat her up and slapped her and spit on her face and calling her an infidel. You're getting this for being here, you infidel. And they said so much so many more horrible things to her. But it was happening while they were saying Allahu Akbar as well. And that's why I say it's religiously motivated. It's politically motivated as well because, like my colleague said and Mr. Gindi said, Copts are a huge force for secularism, and they stand as an obstacle in front of the project of Islamic Khilafah and Islamic imperialism in the region, which obviously since Anwar Sadat has been a believer in this agenda. Mubarak was, and now it's CAF.
If you were given an audience personally with Secretary Clinton or President Obama, what would you say to them? How would you appeal?
That they should stop supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. The founders of Hamas and Al-Qaeda are not moderate, and they should not be engaged in talks with them, any forms of talks. And I think that they should be on the list of the terrorist organization because they are an international organization that uses violent means to reach its aims. And I think it should be incriminated as an entity instead of opening talks with them and ignoring seculars and moderate forces in Egypt.
Thank you. Mr. Ibrahim, you mentioned that the news coverage was very inadequate, even on Fox News. How would you better communicate to the American public? What would you suggest that we do to educate the American public as to the facts that you've elaborated on as a scholar?
Well, I mean, to educate the public, of course, academia is one place to start, and that I just read a report about how school textbooks and high school books completely whitewash and the history that you will read about Islam and how the euphemisms involved, how Islam expanded through trade and not jihad. And yet you go to any Muslim school in the Arab world and they proudly teach their kids that we spread through the sword, through violence and through force. So that sort of disconnect where you have one group openly and proudly boasting of their militant background, and then you have another group who stands to suffer from this, teaching generations of Americans that no, this isn't true, and we're not, and not at all, in fact, just treating it as objective history. I mean, that's the whole point of education, is to relay facts as we can ascertain them. And so to whitewash it in such an absurd manner, the things that you read now, and it's not just, of course, at the elementary or high school level, it's in college. College, you go, and all of these, the sources, and this is what always amazes me, the sources, the textual, documented sources by authoritative Muslims that make all of these things that we're discussing 100% clear, that the Christian or the non-Muslim is a dhimmi who is to be suppressed, that, or the historical aspects of what has been happening up until the recent era, and they're all written by authoritative Muslims. All of this, you won't find this in a class being taught, because those classes are more focused on teaching how Muhammad liberated women and any sorts of other fantasies that somehow can make, in other words, what's happening now with academia is reality is being forced and conformed to fit into ideologies and what we'd like it to be, not vice versa, which is what should happen. And of course, the media again is, you will recall, for instance, there was the business of the Christian pastor in Iran who's set to be executed for refusing to go back to Islam as an apostate. And, you saw that, and I talked to a lot of people, and they were all amazed. So many people, they couldn't believe it. And to me, though, I can't believe that this example that they reported is one out of thousands that's going on right now in the Muslim world. In fact, I did a little study at the same time that the media had finally reported about this one pastor. There were about half a dozen others who were set to be executed around the Muslim world. There were all sorts of other things, not just forget about the sheer persecution that goes on, but just very similar things. There were blasphemy, people who were arrested for blasphemy and waiting to be executed. Churches were burned, this and that. None of those made it into the media. We got this one in, and that's good, and that opened to many people's eyes. And the question I got is, wow, I didn't know that. People really do that? And you see, to someone from my background who's immersed in this and studies this, it just shows me what a great kind of disconnect there is between the Western public and the world view and reality and what's really happening on the ground. And this business again of trying to portray the Muslim Brotherhood as the good guys. This is absurd, as Cynthia said. These are the guys who begat Al-Qaeda. These are the guys who gave the world Sayyid Qutb, who actually articulated the entire vision of the modern-day radical movement. And to say, and these are the guys who have learned and perfected the art of taqiyya, which is basically another mandate under Islamic law that teaches Muslims to deceive infidels by acting moderate and by renouncing violence and by doing all these things until, of course, you're strong enough, and then you implement the real and full Sharia. And this, again, taqiyya, for instance, is another thing that is so well founded in Islamic law and Islamic tradition and Islamic history. It's not anything. It's not something that's open to debate. And they say it and they use it. And this is the amazing thing. All this, we have all the facts, all the reality. if we lived in a different age, we would not have to have a hearing, because it's just common sense what's happening. But I think because of all these factors that I've discussed, from the media to academia to this anachronistic worldview that, 200 years ago the Muslim world was subdued and was abandoning Islam and not really attacking, all of these have made it so hard to see reality. And the reality is that it's all coming back now in full force. Just in as much as the Islamic world experiences its resurgence and this whole global Islamic movement, so too will all the aspects that are part and parcel of Islamic history and doctrine come back. Among them, of course, in our case, is Christian persecution, which was it's intrinsic to the Islamic history and doctrine. And now, as Salafists and Muslim Brotherhood and people start trying to reclaim their Islamic identity and throw off things like nationalism, which was more popular a few generations ago, Arab nationalism, and turn their back on the West, all of these ugly aspects of 1,400 years of Islamic imperialism and subjugation are going to come back, and that's what we're seeing now. But like I said, it's the early stages, so hopefully there's still room for maneuver.
Well, thank you. I hope you'll continue to speak out and educate and advocate in the news, with news organizations, in schools, in universities, academic settings, as well as to public policymakers and government. You've been very generous with your time, and I want to thank you for your excellent testimony and your recommendations. This concludes the third and final panel. In conclusion, Egypt is at a crucial crossroads. This is a critical period, and so it would behoove all of us to speak up on this issue, the worsening plight of Egyptian Coptic Christians, which has been the subject of today's hearing. The Commission's received excellent testimony today, and the U.S. should adopt policies, as well as encourage international organizations to adopt policies that will help Egypt move in the right direction as far as democratic principles and human rights principles are concerned, especially for minorities. So with that, we thank you all for your attendance, for your testimony, and this hearing is adjourned.